The Galactic Council chamber fell silent when Ambassador Theron of the Krillian Empire made his declaration. His crystalline form refracted the chamber's ambient light into 1,000 fractures, each one seemingly carrying a fragment of his contempt. They were discussing the newest applicants for membership in the Galactic Union, and one species had sent ripples of concern through every delegation present: the humans. Theron's voice resonated through the vast hall, each word carefully chosen, each syllable dripping with disdain. The humans, he proclaimed, were too violent, too aggressive, too steeped in warfare to ever join civilized society. They were primitives who had turned their own world into a graveyard more times than any species in recorded history. The Council should reject their application immediately, he insisted, before they brought their plague of violence to the stars. General Sarah Chen sat in the observation gallery, her expression carefully neutral. She had been selected to represent humanity because of her military background, not despite it. The Council wanted to understand what humans truly were, and she embodied what they feared. 53 years old, with scars mapping stories across her hands, she had spent 3 decades in service. She had seen war, made war, ended wars. And now she listened to an alien diplomat condemn her entire species for the very thing that forged them. Theron didn't understand. None of them did. They looked at humanity's history and saw only carnage, measuring humanity against some cosmic standard of peaceful evolution. They had no context for what those wars meant, what they had created, what they had caused. When Chen was finally given the floor, she let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then she stood and spoke with the weight of 10,000 generations. She told them they were right. Humanity was violent. Humanity had waged war upon itself with unmatched ferocity. But they were asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether humans were violent, but why they had survived their own violence, and what that survival had forged them into. She painted them a picture of Earth, a world that had tried to kill humanity since the moment the species opened its eyes. Predators and plagues, ice ages and volcanic winters, droughts and floods that should have driven any reasonable species to extinction. Humanity didn't just survive Earth. They conquered it, turning every threat into a tool, every disaster into a lesson. But survival alone didn't make humans gods of war. What made them gods was what they did to each other. For millennia, humanity had been locked in eternal conflict, testing themselves against the ultimate opponent, themselves. They had learned to fight not just for territory or resources, but for ideas, for beliefs, for visions of what the world should be. They had turned warfare into an art form, studying it, refining it, perfecting it. Every human carried within them the accumulated wisdom of countless conflicts. Warfare wasn't just something humans did. It was woven into their existence, as fundamental as breathing. Chen walked to the center of the chamber, her boots echoing in the vast space. She told them about the great human generals. Sun Tzu, who wrote that supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Alexander, who conquered the known world. Napoleon, whose campaigns were studied millennia later. Each one had contributed to humanity's understanding of conflict, building a tradition of martial knowledge unmatched in the galaxy. But the Council didn't see what came after the wars. They didn't see humanity's other gift, the one that made them truly formidable. Humans didn't just make war. They made peace. And when humans made peace, they made it last. She told them about the aftermath of humanity's greatest conflicts. How the most devastating war in human history, one that claimed 100 million lives and left continents in ruins, was followed by the longest period of great power peace in recorded history. How former enemies became the closest allies. How nations that fought each other with genocidal fury rebuilt each other, defended each other, stood together. Because humans understood something fundamental: war wasn't the absence of peace. It was the price of peace. Every war taught them the value of what came after, showed them what they were willing to die for and willing to live for. The scars of their conflicts made them appreciate peace in a way that species, who had never truly fought, never could. The council chamber erupted in murmurs, translators struggling with dozens of languages. Chin stood unmoved, waiting. She knew what they were thinking. They saw her words as justification, rationalization of brutality. They didn't understand she wasn't defending humanity's violence. She was explaining its consequences. When the chamber quieted, the Silithian representative spoke, her telepathic voice resonating in all minds. If humans were such masters of war, what guarantee could they offer that they wouldn't turn that expertise against other species? What would stop them from doing to the stars what they had done to their own world? It was a fair question, Chin acknowledged. She told them about the Terran Defense Forces, the military organization she had served for 30 years. On the surface, it confirmed every fear. Earth had unified and created a military force unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Ships designed for combat. Soldiers trained for warfare. Weapons of sophisticated lethality. But they were looking at it wrong. The TDF wasn't created to wage war. It existed because humanity understood something the peaceful species had forgotten. Peace isn't the natural state of the universe. Peace is what you build when you're strong enough to defend it, and wise enough to know when not to use that strength. Chin pulled up holographic displays, showing battles that had never happened because humans prevented them. 3 times in 50 years, human vessels encountered hostile alien species at the edges of known space. Species that saw the weakness of galactic peace, the complacency of civilizations that had forgotten what it meant to fight. The Krynor swarm, a hive-minded species consuming everything. The Void Reapers, pirates preying on peaceful ships. The Zenthri conquerors, an expansionist empire seeing the Union as ripe for subjugation. 3 times these threats probed civilized space. 3 times they encountered humans. 3 times they retreated, bloodied and broken, their ambitions shattered. The Council never knew about these encounters because humans handled them quietly, without fanfare. They did what needed to be done, then returned to their corner of space. But Chin could see the question in their eyes. If humans defeated threats the galaxy didn't know existed, what did that say about relative power? She let that question hang before continuing. That was exactly the point. That was why humanity needed to be part of the Union, and why the Union needed humanity. She spoke of deterrence, the concept that the best way to prevent war was to be so prepared for it that no rational enemy would dare start one. The peaceful species had grown complacent, not because peace was wrong, but because they had forgotten the alternative. They had created incredible beauty and advancement, but in a bubble, protected by distance and luck from the horrors lurking in darkness. That bubble was shrinking. The galaxy grew smaller as travel improved, as new species made contact, as unknown became known. In that shrinking galaxy, species existed that saw peace as weakness and prosperity as prey. Humanity offered the Union what it desperately needed, the capacity for organized violence in defense of organized peace. Humans could be the shield protecting what peaceful species built, the sword remaining sheathed but ready, the promise of consequences to anyone threatening galactic order. But more, humans could teach what others had forgotten or never learned. That peace without the capacity to defend it is just time before the next war. That diplomacy backed by strength works better than diplomacy backed by hope. That sometimes the most moral action is preparation so thorough you never have to use it. Chen's voice softened. She told him about her granddaughter, 8 years old, growing up on Mars in the first generation born off Earth. A child who had never known war, who lived in a society that had finally found lasting peace. A child who studied history and wept at what humanity had done to itself, who couldn't understand how ancestors could be so cruel. That child was humanity's future. A future where the capacity for war remained, where knowledge and skills were preserved, but existed as deterrent, as reminder, as last resort rather than first response. Her granddaughter would learn about strategy and courage and sacrifice. But she would learn it as history, as cautionary tale, as a legacy never to be forgotten, but also never to be repeated. The holographic display shifted, showing human cities on Earth and throughout the solar system. Gleaming towers, parks filled with children, research facilities pushing boundaries, art galleries and universities. This was what humanity built with their hard-won peace, the civilization forged from ashes of endless conflict. Chin let the images speak, let the council see what humans created when not destroying each other. But she also showed memorials, museums, monuments to fallen soldiers and civilians. Humanity never forgot the cost, never became comfortable enough to forget why peace mattered. Every child visited these places, learned the names, understood the price. A deliberate effort to remember the worst so they could aspire to the best. The Vrexian ambassador asked the question Chin had been waiting for. Why should the council believe humans could control their violent impulses? What evidence existed they wouldn't turn on their allies? Chin smiled, an expression carrying both sadness and pride. She told them about the Mars Rebellion, 40 years past, that nearly tore humanity apart just as they thought they'd escaped their violent history. Mars declared independence, rejecting Earth's authority. Old hatreds flared. The TDF assembled a fleet capable of crushing the rebellion in weeks. Military command drew up plans, calculated casualties, prepared for inevitable conflict. And then humanity stopped. They looked at battle plans, at projections of death, at the cost in lives and potential, and asked a different question. Not, can we win? But, should we fight? The debate consumed humanity for 3 years, bringing them to the brink of war repeatedly. Some demanded military action. Some advocated peaceful separation. Others sought a middle path preserving both unity and autonomy. In the end, humanity had chosen to talk instead of fight. The Mars Accords had created a federation system, where Earth and the colonies maintained independence in local affairs, but united on matters of defense and diplomacy. It wasn't perfect. It satisfied no one completely. But it worked. And more importantly, it proved that humanity could choose peace even when war was easier, even when victory was certain, even when every instinct bred by 10,000 years of conflict screamed at them to fight. That choice, Chen explained, was what separated modern humanity from their ancestors. Not the absence of violent capability, but the wisdom to know when not to use it. The capacity to wage war combined with the discipline to choose peace. That was what made humans valuable to the Galactic Union. That was what made them gods of war in the truest sense. The council chamber had transformed from a place of judgment to contemplation. Chen could see it in their postures, in subtle shifts of alien body language, in how they looked at her differently. They were beginning to understand. But understanding wasn't enough. She needed them to feel it, to grasp not just the intellectual concept, but the emotional reality of what humanity offered. She told them about the human concept of the warrior poet, the idea that the same person could be capable of both terrible violence and profound beauty. She quoted ancient texts, words written by soldiers and generals across millennia. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote philosophy while leading armies. The Japanese samurai who practiced calligraphy alongside martial arts, understanding that mastery of death required appreciation of life. These weren't contradictions. They were complementary truths. The warrior who understood beauty knew what was worth fighting for. The poet who understood violence appreciated what peace truly meant. Humanity had learned this through countless conflicts, refined it through generations of struggle, codified it into their culture and military tradition. A human soldier was trained not just to fight but to think, to feel, to understand broader implications. They studied history and ethics alongside tactics and strategy. They learned about other cultures, other perspectives. They were taught that the greatest victory was one requiring no battle, that sometimes the hardest choice was not fighting when instinct demanded action. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy, Chin declared with quiet intensity. Not just the capacity for war, but the wisdom that came from having fought too many wars, from having paid the price in blood across 10 millennia. The understanding that violence was sometimes necessary but never desirable, that strength was meant to protect rather than dominate, that the true god of war was the one who prevented conflicts rather than starting them. They had learned these lessons the hard way, through mistakes that cost billions of lives, through hubris that nearly destroyed their world, through hatred that seemed impossible to overcome. Every principle they now held sacred had been written in the blood of those who died so future generations wouldn't have to. She told them about the human military academies, institutions that had evolved over centuries from simple training grounds to complex centers of learning where warfare was studied as both art and cautionary tale. Students studied not just military history but all of history, understanding how conflicts arose, how they escalated, how they could have been prevented. They learned not just strategy but philosophy, grappling with questions of just war and moral courage. They studied not just weapons systems, but humanitarian law, understanding that there were lines that should never be crossed regardless of tactical advantage. They were taught that their primary duty wasn't to commanding officers or even to their nation, but to a set of principles that transcended borders and politics. Principles like protecting the innocent, minimizing civilian casualties even at cost to themselves, treating prisoners with dignity, and knowing when to refuse illegal orders even under threat of punishment. These principles had been written in blood, learned through humanity's darkest moments, codified to ensure those moments never happened again. The Galactic Council's session had stretched well beyond its scheduled duration, but no one moved to adjourn. Chin had captured something more than their attention. She had captured their imagination, forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held for millennia about the nature of peace and war, strength and wisdom. The Tyrellian ambassador, whose species had achieved spaceflight without ever experiencing organized warfare, raised a question that cut to the philosophical heart of the matter. If humanity's capacity for war was so central to their identity, so woven into the fabric of their civilization, then weren't they essentially arguing that violence was necessary for a species to reach its full potential? That peace-loving species, like the Tyrellians, were somehow incomplete, somehow lacking because they had never learned to wage war? Chen considered the question carefully, recognizing the sensitivity it represented, the fear that lurked beneath it. She acknowledged the Tyrellian concern with respect and honesty. No, she said, humanity wasn't arguing that all species needed to walk the path of war to achieve greatness. The Tyrellians and others like them had built magnificent civilizations through cooperation and peaceful advancement, had achieved wonders of science and art that humanity was only beginning to understand. Their path was valid, their achievements remarkable, their contributions to galactic civilization invaluable. But she asked them to consider a different perspective. Humanity's wars hadn't made them better than peaceful species. They had made them different. They had given humans a specific set of skills, a particular way of thinking, a unique understanding of conflict and its resolution that complemented rather than competed with the peaceful species' strengths. The galaxy was vast and diverse, filled with countless forms of life, countless ways of being intelligent, countless paths to civilization. Some species evolved in peaceful environments and developed peaceful temperaments. Others, like humanity, evolved in harsh environments that demanded constant struggle. The key insight, Chen explained, wasn't that one path was superior to the other. It was that they needed each other. The peaceful species had built a galactic civilization of incredible beauty and prosperity, but they lacked the tools to defend it against those who didn't share their values. Humanity had developed those tools through bitter experience, but they risked becoming consumed by their own martial culture if left in isolation. Together, they could create something greater than either could achieve alone. The peaceful species could remind humanity of what they were fighting for, could pull them back from the edge when their warrior instincts threatened to overwhelm their better judgment. And humanity could stand as guardians, as the shield between the civilized galaxy and the chaos beyond, ensuring that the peaceful species never had to compromise their values or abandon their nature to survive in a dangerous universe. Chen pulled up new holographic displays, showing projections of potential futures. In one, humanity remained isolated, their application to the Galactic Union rejected. They continued to build their military strength, continued to perfect their capacity for war, but without the tempering influence of peaceful civilizations. Over time, they became what the Council feared, a purely militaristic society that saw every problem as a nail requiring the hammer of force. Their technology advanced, their power grew, but their wisdom atrophied. They became a threat not just to themselves, but to everyone around them, a species of warriors without purpose, seeking conflicts to justify their existence. In another projection, humanity joined the Union, but was forced to abandon their military traditions, to disarm and become peaceful like the other species. At first, this seemed to work. Humans integrated into galactic society, contributed their knowledge and creativity to the collective good. But when the inevitable threats emerged, when hostile species tested the Union's defenses, humanity found themselves unprepared, their warrior culture so thoroughly suppressed that they couldn't respond effectively. The galaxy suffered for it. The third projection showed a different outcome. Humanity joined the Union as they were, gods of war welcomed into a civilization of peace. They maintained their military traditions, their warrior culture, their capacity for organized violence, but channeled it in service of the Union's values. Human soldiers became peacekeepers, using their training to prevent conflicts before they started. Human strategists worked alongside diplomats, understanding the military implications of political decisions, advising on how to negotiate from positions of strength. Human engineers developed defensive technologies that protected trade routes and colony worlds without threatening peaceful neighbors. And most importantly, humans learned from the peaceful species, absorbed their values, evolved their understanding of what strength truly meant. Over generations, humanity transformed from gods of war into guardians of peace, their martial traditions preserved but redirected toward protection rather than conquest. Chen let the projections fade, bringing the Council's attention back to the present moment, to the decision they faced. She understood their fear. She didn't blame them for their hesitation. They were being asked to welcome into their civilization a species that represented everything they had worked for millennia to move beyond. But fear, she reminded them, was what made wise beings make foolish choices. Fear caused them to see threats where opportunities existed, to reject potential allies because they didn't fit comfortable categories. The universe didn't care about their comfort. It didn't care about their philosophical preferences or their desire to avoid unpleasant realities. The universe was vast and dangerous, filled with species and phenomena that threatened everything the Union had built. Humanity couldn't solve all those problems, couldn't eliminate all those threats. But they could help. They could be the voice of hard-earned wisdom, reminding the peaceful species that sometimes strength was necessary to preserve what was precious. She told them about the human concept of the sheepdog, an ancient metaphor that had evolved over millennia but retained its essential truth. In a world of sheep and wolves, the sheepdog was the one who protected the flock. The sheepdog looked like the wolf, had the same teeth and strength and capacity for violence that the wolf possessed. But the sheepdog used those tools to protect rather than prey, to guard rather than hunt, choosing restraint over predation every day. The sheep didn't always understand the sheepdog, didn't always appreciate the constant vigilance, sometimes feared the protector almost as much as the predator because they looked so similar. But without the sheepdog, the flock was defenseless against those who saw them only as prey. Humanity was offering to be the galaxy's sheepdog, to use their terrible capacity for war in service of peace, to stand between the civilized species and the darkness, to be the ones willing to do violence so that others didn't have to. It wasn't a perfect metaphor, Chen acknowledged. Humans weren't asking for blind obedience or unquestioned authority. They weren't claiming moral superiority or demanding special privileges. They were simply offering their skills, their experience, their hard-won understanding of conflict and its prevention, to a civilization that needed those things but didn't yet know it. The eldest of the council finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 3,000 years of life and wisdom. The eldest was a Xylanthian, a species so ancient they had been exploring the stars when most others were still learning to control fire. She had seen civilizations rise and fall, had witnessed the birth of the Galactic Union, and guided it through countless crises. When she spoke, even the most argumentative ambassadors listened. She asked Chen a question that seemed simple, but carried layers of meaning. What did humanity want? Not what they offered, not what they promised, but what they truly desired from membership in the Galactic Union. It was a test, Chen realized. The eldest was giving humanity one final chance to reveal their true nature, to show whether they sought power or partnership, domination or cooperation. Chen's answer would determine not just humanity's membership, but the entire future relationship between her species and the galaxy. Chen stood in silence, feeling the weight of her entire species' future on her shoulders. She thought about Earth, scarred but beautiful, resilient beyond all measure. She thought about the colonies spreading across the solar system, humanity reaching outward with hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. She thought about her granddaughter and the billions like her, children who deserved to grow up in a galaxy where they could reach their full potential. And she thought about the countless humans who had died in humanity's endless wars, whose sacrifices had purchased this moment, whose blood had paid for the wisdom she was sharing. She owed them honesty, owed them the truth even if it cost humanity everything. What did humans want? They wanted to matter. They wanted their suffering to mean something, their wars to have served a purpose beyond simple destruction. For 10,000 years, humanity had fought and bled and died, had turned their world into a crucible of conflict that had forged them into something unique in the galaxy. They had paid a terrible price for their martial excellence, had sacrificed more than any peaceful species could truly understand. They had lost billions to wars that seemed, in retrospect, pointless and avoidable. They had destroyed civilizations, burned libraries of knowledge, set back their own progress by centuries. And now they stood at the threshold of the stars, looking out at a galaxy full of wonders and possibilities, desperate to find a purpose for all that suffering. Desperate to prove that the price they had paid wasn't just the cost of their own survival, but the foundation for something greater. They wanted to protect what was beautiful. They wanted to preserve what was precious. They wanted to stand as guardians so that the peaceful species could continue to be peaceful, so that civilizations that had never known war could continue to not know it. That was humanity's deepest desire, Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. To transform their capacity for destruction into a force for preservation, to turn the gods of war into defenders of peace, to make their terrible history meaningful by ensuring it never had to be repeated by anyone else. They weren't asking for glory or power or dominion. They were asking for purpose, for a role that made sense of their journey, for a place in the galaxy where their unique nature was an asset rather than a liability. The eldest studied Chen with eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars, that had witnessed the full spectrum of what intelligent life could become. And then she did something unprecedented in the council's history. She rose from her seat, descended from the raised dais, where the eldest traditionally remained above all proceedings, and approached Chen directly. The chamber held its collective breath as the ancient being stood before the human general, two representatives of radically different evolutionary paths, separated by millions of years of divergent development, but united in this moment of decision. The eldest placed her hand on Chen's shoulder, a gesture of contact that Xylanthians rarely offered to other species, and spoke words that would echo through galactic history. She said that she had lived long enough to see many species join the Union, had welcomed countless civilizations into the fold of galactic society. She had seen peaceful species and aggressive species, innovative species and traditional species, species driven by logic and species driven by emotion. But she had never seen a species that understood the true cost of power, that had paid the price in their own blood and learned the lessons that payment taught. Humanity, the eldest declared, would be welcomed into the Galactic Union not despite their violent history, but because of what they had learned from it. The Council would grant their membership on the condition that they maintain their warrior traditions, that they preserve their martial culture and their capacity for organized defense. Because the galaxy needed what humanity offered, needed the wisdom that came from knowing war too well to want it, needed the strength that came from surviving their own worst instincts. The peaceful species had built something beautiful, but beauty required protection. They had created something precious, but precious things attracted predators. Humanity would be that protection, would stand as guardians of everything the galaxy had achieved, would be the sword that remained sheathed but ready, the shield that never wavered, the deterrent that made war unnecessary by being so obviously prepared for it. But they would also be teachers, the eldest continued. They would share their hard-won knowledge with the other species, not to make them more violent, but to help them understand the nature of conflict and its prevention. Chen felt tears streaming down her face, the emotional weight of the moment overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Around the chamber, other representatives were responding with their own species' expressions of approval, creating a symphony of acceptance that transcended language and biology. Humanity had been welcomed not as applicants to be judged but as equals to be honored, their painful history recognized not as a source of shame, but as a wellspring of wisdom. The eldest wasn't finished. She told Chun that humanity's journey would not be easy, that they would face challenges and tests that would strain their commitment to peaceful coexistence. There would be species who feared them, who saw only the violence and missed the wisdom. There would be times when the easy path was to resort to force, when their warrior instincts urged them toward solutions that violated the Union's values. There would be moments when they questioned whether the price of membership was worth the sacrifice of their independence, whether serving as guardians was worth the burden it placed upon them. But the eldest had faith that humanity would persevere, that the same resilience that had carried them through 10,000 years of warfare would sustain them through the challenges of peace. Because humanity understood something that many peaceful species had forgotten or never learned. That the hardest battles weren't fought with weapons, but with principles, that the greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, but in hearts and minds, that the true gods of war were those who prevented conflicts rather than waging them. As Chen stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, surrounded by representatives of 100 species from across the galaxy, she felt the weight of her entire species' future settling onto her shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. Humanity had fought for 10,000 years to reach this moment, had paid in blood and tears and endless sacrifice for the wisdom they now offered the galaxy. They were gods of war, yes. But they would be so much more. They would be guardians and teachers, protectors and partners, warriors in service of peace rather than destruction. And in that role, they would finally find the purpose that made all their suffering meaningful, the redemption that transformed their violent history into a foundation for a better future. Not just for humanity, but for every species in the galaxy that chose peace but needed protection, that built beauty but required guardians, that reached for the stars but needed someone to stand watch over the darkness. That was humanity's destiny. That was why they were gods of war. And that was why the galaxy needed them.